I've got Steve Jobs stories. I've got Jack Dorsey stories. I've got Ross Ulbricht stories. You name it, I got them.
All right, Sam has been telling me about a book for probably 10 years in a row, and I finally got around to reading it this year, and the book is American Kingpin. It's the story of the Silk Road, of Ross Ulbricht, who created it, grew it to great prominence, ended up going to jail, what we thought was for life, and then he just got pardoned by Trump. And so Sam just reread the book. I read it this year. We both love this thing. It's a page turner. And the author, Nick Bilton, not only wrote that, but he wrote Hatching Twitter and a bunch of other stuff. Fascinating guy. And he's here with us today on MFM. So let's do it.
Nick, what's going on? We wanted to talk about all types of stuff. We want to talk about storytelling. We want to talk about things that you researched that didn't make the book. We want to talk about like the OG stories of Silicon Valley because you've been covering this stuff forever. But you're like one of the 3 people who we've had on the pod that I'm like nervous to talk to. And I stayed up all night, like reading everything about you.
Don't be nervous. This is exciting. This is fun. It's going to be great. We're going to tell some crazy stories. I've got Steve Jobs stories. I've got Jack Dorsey stories. I've got Ross Ulbricht stories. You name it. I got them.
Who of all those people have you become friends or admire any of them, or are you like strictly like a journalist who doesn't cross the barrier?
Well, that's a great question. I feel like I should save that answer because I've got such great stories about all these people, about Bezos, everyone, where, there are some that I have become friends with and then unfriends with, and some I'm still kind of friends with. But let's save that for when we get into the hatching Twitter, Elon Musk, Jack Dorsey territory of this pod.
I was listening to an episode with David Perel. It was all on writing, and you talk about like what makes a great story. And this sounds like a backhanded compliment. I think that your writing's amazing. Your storytelling is amazing. I think you just happened to pick the best story of all time with the Silk Road. Like it was like set up to win.
Well, let me just tell you how I came to the story. So I was a reporter at the New York Times and in Silicon Valley covering tech. I was writing about Apple and Facebook and Twitter and I don't even know how to describe this moment in time. It was like 2008, 2009. It was, right after the bubble had popped, the second bubble. And it was once again, this no-fly zone, to be in Silicon Valley to do startups and whatnot. And I started covering these companies that were not, there was the idea of one of them being $1 trillion company was it was ridiculous. That would never happen. And I would spend time with Steve Jobs and Bezos and Zuck and Dorsey and all these guys. And I wrote the Twitter book, which we can talk about, and there's incredible backstories to that, and of people trying to kill the project and so on and so forth. But I'd finished the Twitter book, and the Twitter book had done really, really well. And I was looking for a new book, and I couldn't. I love writing books. It's one of my favorite forms of writing to do. And I heard about this guy who had started the Silk Road, who'd been arrested at this little public library that was like 4 blocks from my house. And I knew the library, I knew this, and I knew the area, and I also knew the Silk Road. And so I wrote a piece for the New York Times about it. It's like a short piece. And then I was like, maybe there's a book in this. And as I started to dig further and further, it just felt undeniable. It was just an unbelievable story of this kid who, I say kid because he was very young at the time, but he grew up in Austin. He was incredibly smart, 1600s on his SATs, studied astrophysics, went off to one of the best schools, and then had this like libertarian idealism to him that is no different to like Travis Kalanick when he's building Uber and, all these other people in Silicon Valley. And he decides that drugs should be legal. And the government should not be able to tell you what you can and cannot put in your body. And the only reason that the drugs lead to these, to deaths and murder and so on and so forth is because the government has so much control over it. And so he takes the Onion browser, which is the secret browser that you can, where the dark web exists. And then he takes Bitcoin, which both kind of come along around the same time. And he creates this proof of concept, which is this website called the Silk Road. And then next thing you know, he's making millions and millions and millions of dollars a day as the biggest drug dealer on the internet.
By the way, how good was the branding for that? The fact that he called himself the Dread Pirate Roberts, the Silk Road, the logo behind it, the branding was actually like it was pretty brilliant.
No, the branding was great. I forget the name. There was a name that he had originally wanted to call it. It was like some terrible name.
It was called like Hardcore Underground or something, it was something where it was like, this doesn't sound like a piece. Like I'm interested in that.
But what's fascinating is, at the time he's living in Austin, he's got this girlfriend Julia, and they're kind of in this like toxic relationship, and he has this business, and it's a pretty like nice business where he goes around and he collects books that people want to get rid of and then sells them and mails them out. So when he moves into the drug trade and he goes to Bastrop State Park and he rents a cabin and he grows mushrooms so that he could sell drugs on there to show that you can sell drugs on there. And then he starts mailing them out, like he's mailing the books out and then the drugs out, and it all kind of, it all comes together in this very, very unique way. What ends up happening is Gawker, the website that is obviously now defunct, they write about it, and then that's it. It's like game over. Like everyone on the planet knows about it, and senators are coming after him, and every government official from the IRS to the FBI to the Secret Service to the DEA, they're all trying to hunt down the Dread Pirate Roberts, and Ross essentially goes on the run around the world as they're trying to catch him.
Yeah, it's one of the best things about the book is that it starts with like, I don't know how much of this is your conjecture versus you had his diary, I guess, and you knew some of his thoughts, but it's like, he knows he's smart. He wants to do something special. He's sort of bummed out that he hasn't done anything interesting or special with his life, and has sort of tried but hasn't really made it yet doing anything. And then you've got his girlfriend, and there's that part of it. They got the libertarian ideals, and then it leads to the thing escalates like crazy. Where I think I don't know if at its peak, but I think Silk Road was doing like, over $1 billion like GMV through the marketplace.
Yeah.
And there's like, murder for hire plots going on. Like it escalates like the craziest crime movie would escalate. But I like that you had that beginning part where it wasn't just this criminal mastermind. It was like this smart kid, just trying to do something and had a certain set of ideals. How did you know what he was thinking? How did you get access to his diary? How does a writer like you get that? And you got a lot of stuff. You got like the footage of the library where he got arrested. You got like the chat logs from with the government. How did you get access to all this information?
Well, I can't tell you exactly how I got a lot of it because that's investigative reporting, and I obviously can't divulge where it came from. But the way I approach these stories is I want to know everything, literally everything. And so I have these researchers who work for me, and one of them actually used to do Oppo research for the Democratic Party, trying to find bad stuff on Republicans, and we literally just blanket approach it. And what's been really interesting, I have a new project which I can't talk about, but I can tell you a little bit about how I've been reporting it. What's been interesting is it's a new project that we're doing, and we've been using Google LLM's notebook. And so now we stuff millions of words into these things and I can just query it. Whereas before we had to build like Excel spreadsheets and databases, and like it was very, very complicated the way we did it. But we kind of put it into three tranches. So we have the Dread Pirate Roberts, and we get access to the chat logs that were on his laptop, which I don't actually know if he knew were there because they were in a hidden folder. And I don't think he actually knew he'd been saving them, or maybe he was, I don't know. And then there's some diary entries. He'd literally been making a diary about the thing because the best line ever is he thought there'd be a book written about his life one day. And then we go through social media and we get all the photos and all the posts and all that. And everything's on a timeline. It's all got timestamps. And then lastly, it's the interviews with everyone. And as far as like, we reach out, you get yearbooks and you go and you find out everyone he went to elementary school with, the middle school and high school, and you interview everyone. You find the neighbors, the kid that lived across the street, which coffee shop he went to, you go to the coffee. And then the thing I do, which is a little psychotic, but I do it anyway, is I want to be able to describe I want you to feel like it's a novel in some respects, but it's all real, like nothing's made up. And so like if I know let's say he took a picture, there was one instance where he went camping and so I didn't know where the campground was. It was near San Francisco, but he had taken three pictures, sorry. One was when he left and we could figure out the street because we could, see the angles and the street signs. The next was when he was driving over the Golden Gate Bridge. And then the third was when he got to the campground. And we could tell the timestamps, so we just did the math and we're like, okay, it's probably 45 to 50 miles away. And then we looked in the circle around San Francisco, and then we found these different campgrounds, and I went to one, and there we are at the campground. So I go there, and I find the place that he took the picture from, where he's sitting. I sit in that spot, and I can smell the everything, and so I can describe that because it hasn't changed in 6 months or a year. It still looks the same, and so I do that with like everything. I go to the coffee shops he goes to. I walk the same street, and so you get to describe this, and then you also can look, with different apps where you can see the way the sun comes on certain days, and you can describe what the shadows look like. And you just can describe everything.
Sam, isn't this wild? Like, it's wild in two ways. One, it's the same sort of obsession of why Jobs is like, I'm going to design, we need to finish the inside of the casing of the computer. And they're like, Steve, nobody's going to see this. And he's like, I've seen it. I know it's there. That's why we have to finish the inside case. So this is a weird kind of product obsession, which I respect. But then there's also like, dude, nobody would know. Nobody would ever know, and it might not ever matter. Why does it matter to you to do that?
Well, and it's also weird that, Nick, you've written, like, Hatching Twitter wasn't the most favorable towards, like, Jack Dorsey and some of these guys. You guys all have the same flavor of crazy, though. You know what I mean? Like, that's what Shaan's describing is, like, what the greats have.
Look, I totally agree. Look, I mean, it's fun for me. I think it's, like, I love the challenge. But it's what's interesting, you bring up Jobs, like, I spent quite a lot of time talking to him when he was alive, and he was incredibly obsessive, and of course, and one of the things that he always said that he said it publicly too, but like, you should never know that the technology exists and how it happens and so on and so forth. And I'm fine coming on a podcast and talking about how I did it, but when you're reading, I'm not going to tell you. Like, there's nothing that drives me more insane where it's like, according to a transcript that I found, it's like, who gives a shit? Like, just tell me the story. And like, and I think that one of the beauties of great products is when you don't know how it works, and I think one of the it just works, and it's magical, and it's all those words that they use in the ads and everything. And I think the same is true for storytelling. Like, a lot of the greatest novels, I'm a voracious reader. I read a ton of novels, and a lot of the greatest novels, the amount of research that people like Gabriela Garcia Marquez put into 100 Years of Solitude and like into Chess. It's like, when you read these, they're not telling you all this. They're just telling you a story. And
why would I saw that I think you said in another podcast you spent like 3 or 4 weeks with Julia, Ross's ex-girlfriend, when he was starting it. And and I didn't know that you had spent time with them when I spent time with her, because I was like, why on earth would she ever talk to Nick? Like, if I'm her, I'd probably just kind of shut up. But you knew stories, like you knew like when they had sex, or like the comments that they made to each other. I'm like, how on earth does he know this? And then I find out that I heard you spent time with her, like getting info. Why on earth would some of these sources talk to you? Why not? Why wouldn't they just say, I don't need that in my life. Get out of here.
I think one of the things I've learned as a reporter for 2 decades is that people want to talk for different reasons. So there's endless numbers of them, and one of I think people think being a reporter is like, you got to break the news and you got to write the story. It's like, no, it's relationships. It's like, it is literally just relationships, and what you have to do is you have to figure out, you need these people to talk to you, and you have to figure out how to make them want to talk to you. And so, for example, everyone has a reason. So people that would leak stuff to me that worked at Apple or Facebook, some of them were so excited to say, oh my God, I worked on this thing. And it was like, and they just want it out there, and they don't have the patience, and others of them worked on something that never got made, or they got fucked over by their boss, or they didn't get the credit, and or they have the egotistical reasons, whatever it is. And so your job as a reporter is to try to get them to talk to you and to try to figure out, and my job is to be like, what can I say to you? What is it that you want? I know you want, we all want something. And so with Julia, I think she wanted to be part of the story. And I think she wanted to be famous a little bit. And I also think that for her, there was some things that hadn't been said and hadn't been finished, and that she hadn't. It was like a little bit cathartic, I think, in some respects. And so that's the reason she talked. When it came to the agents, I spent time with all of the agents involved in the case, or almost all of the agents. And and with Jared T. Yegan and I probably spent 400 hours, 500 hours together. I went to his office, I went to his house, I went to we met in all different places. I saw the postal service where he worked, and we went inside the Chicago airport and underneath the bowels of it. And it was amazing to see all this stuff.
Shaan, do you remember that? So Jared was the guy who he wanted to be an FBI agent or something like that, but he ended up being a Homeland Security agent, which is like
I think the book starts with him. It's like
he discovers a pill.
Yeah, a single pill.
One pill. And what shocked me about Homeland Security and mail is that they would just sit there and watch packages come in, and they would just be like, that envelope looks weird because it's handwritten in a certain way, and it's just similar. Like, it's just so crazy that one of a few different ways that he was caught was just like traditional police work as opposed to like something more complex. It was shocking that it was just like eyeballing things.
Well, it's why I started with the pink pill, the single solitary pink pill, is because, and then there's a line, there's a paragraph in the book about how the website started with a single line of code, and all of a sudden he creates this world and so on. I think what's interesting about technology, and this was just me, the way I wanted to tell the story, but what's interesting about technology, there's also the scene where, and I say scenes because I think of them in my head as scenes, they're not chapters, everything's visual in my head. And there's this scene where we see a computer being built, and it starts with like a single diode. And what I find so fascinating about technology is all these websites and all these products and all these companies, they start with this one thing. And the same with the books and everything. And they grow into these, they take over the world. And so for me, the pink pill, the single solitary pill of ecstasy, was the beginning of the story, which was just going to become a fucking tidal wave that took over everything.
Did you ever feel in danger during your research?
I felt more in danger doing the Twitter book, quite honestly.
What was the danger there? The powers that be didn't want?
Jack Dorsey did not want that book out. And he was trying to do everything he could.
Dude, he's a peace-loving hippie, as far as I could tell. He sits with a beard and a tie-dye shirt. He just wants peace and love for all, I thought.
No, that is all a story that he tells. Look, there are definitely stories I've worked on. I wrote a book I chose not to publish, which was about the NRA. This was after Marjorie Stoneman Douglas had happened, because I went to school there, and it's been a couple of years on the book, and then decided to not do it for a few reasons. But that one, I wouldn't even say that I wasn't like afraid someone would come after me, except maybe like some gun nuts later. I've done some stories, mafia stuff, like Russian hackers, things like that. And I've never, I think a lot of the times people respect the process, and they don't want to start a war with the New York Times or Vanity Fair, or
Right.
I think it's different if you're like covering Mexican cartels in Mexico. That's a whole different thing. Or if you're trying to be a reporter in Russia or something like that, that's where you really do have to start to worry. But in Silicon Valley, it's a bunch of nerds that talk a big game, and that's it. I do have one story, but it's from the Twitter book. So when I won't mention names here, but when I wrote the Twitter book, and there's a moment in the book where someone gets fired, and I got a call from a friend who's a journalist at Bloomberg, and they said, "Hey, there's a bunch of people, these like crisis PR people, that are trying to, they're calling all the journalists. They just called me, and they're trying to say that your book is all fabricated and it's not true, and especially this moment, it's all made up." And I just wanted to let you know. And I just called this woman directly, and I was like, "Hey, I heard you're calling everyone and saying," and she's like, "I didn't say that." And I said, "Look, I have the tapes of the interviews and of that moment." And I was like, "I will happily post it on Twitter." I said, "You just keep calling people, and I'll put it on Twitter." And that was the end of it. So, so there are these moments where you get these crisis comms people that come after you, but
well,
whatever.
When you do as much research as you do, you end up getting to know the subject in some ways better than themselves. It's like these business, CEOs will pay for these expensive 360 reviews where somebody goes and talks to their wife and their coworkers and their interns, and they come back with this feedback, and it's supposed to be this eye-opening thing about them. This person can find out more about them and show them a mirror that they haven't really seen before. In that case, they want it. But, when you're researching Jack Dorsey and you say something like, that's all a story, who's the real Jack Dorsey?
Well, I think just one thing about what you just said is I know somebody asked me once, how do you know when your book is done? When you're ready to because what happens is you research for a long time. You don't write a word until you're ready, until you've done all the research and you have everything. And I have in my office, I have these boards and I create these cards that you can, where they're just all the scenes in different colors and everything, and put them up on a wall. And I know that when I'm ready to write, when I start telling the people I'm writing about things they don't know about themselves. And that's the moment I'm like, okay, I got it. And so that happened with the Twitter book. I remember sitting with all the founders, and there was a moment where I told Evan Williams something that had happened behind his back that I thought he knew about, and he had no idea. And I was like, oh, okay, well, there you go. I'm ready. And, as far as Jack specifically goes, the best quote I ever got about Jack Dorsey, and I've written a lot about him, was from one of the board members years ago who said the best product Jack Dorsey ever made was Jack Dorsey. Because that's what it is. It's everything is a story, right? Every single solitary thing we do every single day is us telling a story. The outfit you chose to wear today is a story about yourself. Me telling a story about the book is me. It's all we're doing all day long, and we're telling these stories, and we choose which story we want to tell certain people based on how they want us to perceive us. And I think that people like Jack and Jobs and Bezos, all of these guys, and Zuck, that's one of the things they're great at is telling a good story. And I think, I personally believe that your story for a company is more important than anything. I don't care if you have the greatest product in the world. If you can't tell a story about it, well, what's the point?
What's the example that drives that home?
YouTube is a perfect example. YouTube was not the first video platform. There were dozens. And I remember seeing this. When I was just a beat reporter covering Silicon Valley, and my days were it was office hours, and you'd have startup after startup in 2009, 11, 12 come in and meet with you, and they would have, some of them have great ideas, but they couldn't walk you through it, and they didn't hire a PR person, and they didn't and so, and YouTube had a great story and that they were able to tell, and it became the video platform. There were other video platforms that were, I would argue, way better than YouTube. And I mean, Vimeo is a perfect example. Vimeo was a 1,000 times of a better product, and a prettier, easier to all these things. And YouTube just told a great story, and Google helped them do that. And that's what it becomes. And if Jack Dorsey had told the real story about Twitter, that his best friend Noah Glass really was the one that came up with most of it, and he stole it, from him, and that the place was a shit show and no one knew what was going on. It was all an accident. You'd be like, oh, okay. But to tell the story that I am the next Steve Jobs, and I conceived of this idea of Twitter while I was in my mother's womb, and holy shit, I got to check this thing out. What is this? And it's
the Jack Dorsey Twitter story I know is he grew up and he was just fascinated with dispatch or something like that. He talks about I loved either taxi dispatch or some transportation dispatch service he used to listen to, and that short form dispatch communication was always something he was into. And then when had the idea for Twitter, and he has the sketch of the original Twitter thing that he posts, he's posted before. That's the story that I know, right? Yeah. Because I'm just the receiving end of that product he's created.
So it worked, right? The story worked. Is it true? No, it's not true. Yes, he was interested in dispatch in the same way he was interested in writing poetry and painting his nails black and dyeing his hair blue. But that's not part of the story, because what really happens is, and as I say in Hatching Twitter, and no one knew this. I was I had to talk to all these different people to kind of pin it together, except Noah Glass knew it. Jack was living in San Francisco. He was in his early 30s. He was a part-time Manny in Oakland. His life had not turned out in any way like the predestined version of Jack Dorsey we think of today. He got a job working at a, the ticketing booths at Alcatraz. So there are these booths that are pretty small, and he was the C programmer who would go and fix the ticketing booths. And the reason he got the job was because he was small enough to fit inside the booth and program. So this was the life he was living, and he applied for a job at Camper Shoes to sell shoes, not like to build the website or be the CEO, and he couldn't get the job, and he was at a coffee shop, and Evan Williams walks in, and he'd read an article about Evan, and he just felt like it was a sign, which it probably was. The universe was putting them together. So he sent him a note, and he said, I'm a programmer, and they had Audio at the time, which was the podcasting company, which was a decade ahead of its time, which was a brilliant idea that Noah Glass had come up with. And so Noah and Evan Williams had created this thing called Blogger, and Blogger was, again, ahead of its time, and Google purchases it. And one day this guy, Biz Stone, reaches out and he says, I love Blogger. I'd love to come work for you. And so Evan Williams and Biz become friends. Jason Goldman, who's also another part of this, he's working at Google. They all kind of become buddies. They end up leaving, and we'll get Goldman stays. But Ev and Biz end up leaving. And the reason that they leave is because Evan lives on, I think it was 18th and Market or whatever the streets were. And one day he was on his balcony, and another guy, Noah Glass, was on his balcony. And Noah had been reading that same article that Jack Dorsey had read. And he recognized in the article that the photo of Ev Williams was taken on the balcony. And in the background, there's a little Noah Glass, because they were neighbors. And so he goes out and he goes, hey, Blogger. And they become friends. And then Noah pitches in this idea for this podcast company. He's like, this is the vision, this is the future, it's going to take over radio and so on. And so Ev is looking for a project, and so he agrees to do it. It's all discombobulated. No one knows what's going on. They can't run the startup. Apple comes along with podcasts. They're screwed. Jack Dorsey comes along, and they do a hack day, and to try to last hurrah to save the company. And they during the hack day, Jack presents this idea for status. Okay, and everyone's kind of doing the same thing. The ideas are very, very similar, and I'll tell you a couple of them. But Jack presents this idea for status, and what status is stat.us/Nick Bilton, right? And you go there and you see my status. It's one status. So if I say, and it's 3-4 words, you're not really supposed to do anything more than that, on a podcast. Now, if you go an hour from now, if I post a new status and I'm taking a walk, the on a podcast is gone, and it now just says taking a walk.
It's like an AM away message.
It's literally an AM away message that they were doing. And so Noah has a very similar idea, but Noah's like, no one is going to go stat.us/Nick Bilton 5 times. Your mom will do it because she wants to know what you're up to, but no one else is doing that. And so they all start bringing these ideas together, and it's 11 people in the room. It is a collaboration between all of them. And what Noah has this realization is he's a very emotional guy, very smart, and he's like, it needs to be about friendship. It needs to be about connecting with your friends, and that is what it's about. And so he brought this humanity to it. And so he came up with the stream and the it's like all, not the ad replies, but the friends, that you had friends and that was Twitter. It wasn't status. There were a million other statuses back then. I mean, and so when it ends up becoming what it became, Noah was a mess. He was getting divorced. He was his life just wasn't work, and he gets pushed out by Jack and Ev and Jack, who is best friends with Noah, goes into Ev's office one day and he says, either you get rid of Noah or I quit. And as far as Ev knew, Jack had come up with the idea himself, when he was a little kid listening to fire trucks. That was a story that was added later. and so, but the better story is not, oh, I screwed over my best friend for power and control of this thing. It's when I was a kid, I used to sit in my room at 12 years old and I had the vision for Twitter by listening to fire trucks. Okay, that's a great story. And so,
You seem like you don't like Jack Dorsey. Is it you don't like him, or you just feel like that's a wrong that needs to be righted, that story?
Yes,
you want to correct the record?
That is, I don't like people who fuck other people over, especially their friends.
Did you find yourself, like, you had this great podcast with our friend David Perel, and you said a line that someone came up with, where it was, every villain has a mother. And it was like, I guess, like, you see yourselves in the villain at times. That's what good stories do. You kind of like a villain a little bit, or they're a little, you're interested in them. Did you find yourself liking Ross? Did you find yourself liking Jack at times? Like, because you get so into their minds, and you also see that, like, even though they do a lot of bad things, they do a lot of epic things, a lot of big things. Do you find yourself admiring and liking them?
Well, they all have a charisma to them, you know, that you can't pull this off without the charisma. I met Trump. He's very charismatic, very, very charismatic. You like want to be around him, even if you don't agree with him.
What was the context? How'd you meet him?
Oh, just at a rally once, years and years and years ago, I think 2015 or something like that. You know, spent time with Elon. Like, he's kind of funny. He's funny. He's like a weird dude, but he's funny. You know, Jobs had this like aura to him. You know, Bezos too. Like they, funnily enough, Zuck doesn't necessarily have the charisma, but it's almost like he's a robot, and you're like, oh, how does this thing work? But they all have this. There's something to them that is enticing, and Jack's funny. He's a funny, nice guy. Like when you're hanging out with him, he like it's like you're like, oh, he's fun. I like hanging out with this guy, and I never met Ross. I covered him in the trial, so I saw him many times, but never spoke to him. But they have this charisma to them that I think makes them great in some respect, and it's not something that you can learn. It's just something that you either have or you don't have, and so you cannot help but like them for that. But I think for me, I don't understand. Here's the part with Jack, and then we should move on from it, because I could talk all day about this. But Jack is worth $12 billion, give or take. Noah Glass is worth about $0. Okay, he never got anything. Ev gave him something, and he had to live off that and whatnot. If you're worth $12 billion, give the guy $10 million. You wouldn't even notice. It would literally be like losing a penny between your couch cushions. And like that, to me, even if you believe that you are the creator, even if you believe that you really came up with this on your own, because he may believe that today. I just don't understand like why the kid that you were the guy you were best friends with, who without question helped you with this product, like, go take care of him. And it never happened. And for me,
Glass, I agree with you. But also, Noah Glass now has a thing too, right? Doesn't he have Olo or?
No, that's a different Noah Glass.
No shit. They're not the same guy?
Not the same guy.
So
no. Everyone thinks that.
I thought they were I thought it was like his second
guy.
coming.
No, he has a family, and he married this French woman, and they have 2 kids, and I think
not only Twitter got stolen from him, his own name got stolen. His name space on Google got stolen from him too. This guy gets no credit.
Mess him up.
I did not know that. I thought it was like, oh, he's getting it back.
No.
Oh man, that ruined the story for me.
Can you tell us some other stories of that have stood out to you? Things you still remember, either experiences, whatever. You said like, I got job stories, I have Zuck stories, I have Elon stories.
Let's do Jobs is the best one. I think I'll do the job story. So when I was a reporter at the Times, I didn't really know what I was doing. Like, no one knows what you're doing when you start out in these jobs. You pretend you do, but you don't. And I don't even think, I think the 10,000 hours is nonsense. I think it's about 30,000, right? To really understand what you're doing properly. But I was at the Times, and what had happened was I'd come into the Times by complete accident. Let me just start with that story, because it's actually a very funny story. So my dream job was, I wanted to be a war photographer. And I'd read all these war photography books, and I saved up and bought like a fancy camera, and I would like do practice war photography with my friends, where they would like run through the streets with, and I would take pictures. And so I put together this portfolio, and I was a graphic designer, and I'd done toy package design for a while, and I'd like designed the first Britney Spears doll and stuff like that. And so I was like, oh, I can use the designer job to get to the Times as a designer, and then I can become a war photographer. And so I end up doing that. I do page layouts and stuff like that. And when you do the way these meetings work is these newspapers, you have a morning meeting where all the editors and reporters go in one big room, and each section, the business section, the culture section, the front page, and so on, they pitch their stories. The editor decides which is going to go where on the front page, and off you go. But I would always speak up because I didn't know you weren't supposed to. And so I'd be like, well, what about this? And what about that? And I like that. And what if you did this? And I just became like friendly with a lot of the editors. And one day I sit down with the photo editor and I show her my photos. And she looks through them. Her name was Michelle McNally. And she like slowly goes through one by one. And she closes the book. And she's like, you're a good photographer. And she's like, I think you'd be a good war photographer, but I'm not going to hire you to do it. And I was like, why not? And she goes, because you're too normal. She's like, these guys are fucked up. They're on drugs. They can only be in a war zone half the time. Like they've just got something that's missing, that they need that adrenaline. And she was like, I don't feel that from you. And I'm so grateful that she said that. And so I was like, well, what do I do now? And there was, at the Times, I'd become friends with Marissa Mayer, and that was talking about going over to Google to go to Google News. And I mentioned this to the editor-in-chief of the business section. And he said, oh, God, I wish we could keep someone like you to be like a reporter, because everyone wants to write for the print section. No one wants to write for the web. And the words just came out of my mouth. I never wanted to be a writer. It had never been anything on my list of things I wanted to do. And I said, well, I would do it. And he was like, oh, well, why don't we try it? And then I was like, oh, shit, what have I done? And so the first day I'm on the job at the New York Times, and I'm in this massive newsroom with all these insane people that, back then you were just like enamored by, these bylines that you were just like, holy shit. And my editor comes over, and funnily enough, it was Twitter had gone down. And he said, Twitter's gone down. Can you write a blog post about it? Call the company and everything. And I was like, yeah, no problem. And so I looked at my computer and I Googled, how do you write a blog post? So that was my first. And then I realized, like, oh my God, what have I done? I've found myself in this job that I just don't know what to do. And so I spent weeks just reading every byline of the greatest reporters. And I was like, okay, this is how they write the intro. This is how they do the quotes. This is how they do the nut graph. And I just figured it out. And I made mistakes, but like that was my foray into it. So one day, about, I don't know, 6 months, a year into me being a tech blogger for the Times, I reach out to Apple, as you call and you say, hey, I'm doing the story on this. Do you have a comment? And the PR woman that answers, she says, Steve's going to call you. And at the time, there was a guy called Steve Dowling, who was like a very senior comms person. And I was like, oh, cool, Steve Dowling. And she goes, no, Jobs. And I was like, what? And I was like, is that normal? Does that happen? And she goes, sometimes he's going to call you, wants to talk to you. And I'd been writing a lot of Apple stuff. And so he never called. And that night I went out for dinner with my girlfriend at the time. And we went for sushi, and I had like a few sakis. And then all of a sudden I get a phone call from this number in San Jose, and I answer it, and it's Jobs. And I was like a little tipsy. And he talked to me for like an hour, and he just like convinced me not to do the stories in the way I did it. And it didn't make any sense, but he made so much sense. And he was like, oh, well, you got this wrong and that. And then if you look at this, you can, and then the next day, so I wrote the piece, and then a couple of days go by. You know when like you've seen a movie and then all of a sudden you process the movie and then it's like, oh, that makes sense. I played this conversation back in my head and I was like, holy shit, he convinced me not to do the story that was the right story.
He got you.
He got me. And so John Markoff, who is a veteran reporter, I told him, and he just says, it's the reality distortion field. And I was like, what's that? And he goes, Jobs invented it. And every time I would talk to him from time to time, and every time it was the same thing. It was like this, he had this ability to make you believe that what you were doing was not the right story and that this was the way to do it. It was a really fascinating thing to see.
How does the reality distortion, because I've heard that so many times, the reality distortion field, never been in it, you've been in it. What is he actually doing in your opinion? You're a smart guy, you're a storyteller, you're a persuasive guy, you've been around other charismatic people. Is it just his aura? Is it his gravitas? Is he really good at reframing things? Is it intimidation? What is he actually doing?
And it's one of those things where you hear about and you're like, that won't happen to me.
No, exactly. It's hard to describe what he's doing because it's so interesting. He convinces you that you're wrong and you believe it. And look, I think there's a part of Jobs that we should all admire and respect and be really amazed by. But there's a part of him that he could be a real asshole. Like Walter Isaacson told me this story once. Jobs he presented the iPad and then what they did back then, they don't do it anymore as much because the media has changed so much. But what they did back then was they would go around to all the newsrooms around the country and they would meet with the editorial boards and the reporters in off the record, in total private, and they would show you the products that they were doing. So, and presidents would do it too. And, you would sometimes get invited. They'd be like, Bush is here, or the Secretary of State, like come in. It's a huge, at the New York Times, it was this massive conference room. And on the walls were all these photos of all the dignitaries that had come over the last 150 years and business people and so on. And so we got a call that Jobs was coming. And there was 20 of us that were invited to this thing. And I ended up getting sat next to Brad Stone, who now runs Bloomberg Business. And Jobs was right next to him. And Brad was the Apple reporter at the time, and I was the tech blogger. And there was this moment where he brings an iPad prototype, and, we're playing with them and everything. And I was prodding it too hard. And he was like, stop it. You're hitting it too hard, Nick. And I was like, okay. But then he says, this is another reality distortion field. This actually will make more sense. He says, we're doing questions and answers and everything. And then I said to him, Steve, I saw you a couple of years ago at Cupertino, and you were sitting there was 3 stools on stage, and you were on one of the stools, and you had just presented the Apple television box. And I said, you said that you see Apple as having these 3 businesses, right? There's the Mac and there's the iPod, because that's what it was back then, and whatever. And I said, and then you said Apple TV will be the 4th leg. So the stool will become a chair, something like that. And I remembered it verbatim back then. And he goes, I never said that. And I was like, no, you said that. I'm pretty sure you said that. And he goes, I never said that. He goes, I've never said that about Apple. Apple Television's an experiment for us. We're just playing with it. It's like, because it wasn't doing very well at the time. And that was my question, was like, it's not doing very well. Like, did you say that incorrectly? And I was like, and I'm sitting there with all the editors and and the big macas at the New York Times. And I'm like, and I'm just like this young reporter. And I'm like, no, you definitely said that. And he goes, Nick, I never said that. And I was like, okay. And then I just like shut up. And then afterwards, John Markov was there again too. I pulled it up on my computer and I watched the video. I was like, he said it. And he goes, reality distortion field. And that was just it. And so what was I going to do? Go run around to the 20 people in that room and say that he made it up? No, he did what he did and it worked. And they all believed that was just an experiment.
Right. Are there any of these guys that you felt like had it all? Meaning they have the extreme success. They're the extreme achievers of society. But, most of the time you look and they're on their 5th wife and they're kind of the stories that they're kind of an asshole to work for, or that they screwed somebody over or whatever, right? Like they have, same as this quote, show me a great man and I'll show you a bad man, right? Like, there's this stereotype with that. Was there anybody you met that you were like, no, this person's actually, they had it, they had the career success, but they also were a good family man, or they were actually good to be around. They're a good human being to be around.
Yeah, people who you would say they're winning.
Yeah.
There was one person, and I say was. There's 2. There are other people. Look, I think like there are really good people in Silicon Valley. They're not the most successful of they're not worth the hundreds of billions. Like I love Aaron Levy. I think he's a great guy. Like Dennis Crowley. There's a long list of people that I really, really admire and like, and I think are good people. But there was one person that I was like, oh, you have it all. And I had met him because I had done these series of stories on the Kindle, and it was Jeff Bezos. And I remember spending time with Bezos. And when I became a columnist at the New York Times. Like when I got promoted to be a columnist, there was a guy, I worked with David Carr, who was just a wonderful, wonderful human being, who was the media columnist. And he's since passed away, but he was everyone's mentor. He would make time for anyone. He was just a lovely, lovely person, so smart. And when I became a columnist, the first few columns I wrote, I was like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And David used to smoke outside, and I would go down and like hang out with him. And he said, pick a fight that you can win. That's what you need to do the first time when you first become a columnist. So I was flying out to LA for Thanksgiving, and I was reading a book on my Kindle back then. It was like 2010 and 9, 11, 12. And I was reading a book on my Kindle. It was like 3 pages to go. And I was like, oh my God. And they were like, you must put your devices off now and put them in airplane mode and whatever. And I wanted to finish. So I was like hiding the book so I could finish it. And the stewardess was like, we are not allowed to take off, sir, until you turn that off. And I was like, it's a calculator. Like, it's not going to destroy the plane. And she got very terse. And I was so angry that when we finally got up to altitude, I wrote a column about just how ridiculous it was. And it got published like the next day or whatever. And it was like the most read thing on the New York Times for weeks. And I was like, oh, I'm picking this fight. And so I went to all these testing facilities, because back then there were rules in the FAA. You could use a razor, a tape recorder, a heart monitor, and some other. So we got all these
Shaan
things.
calls it going to petticourt.
Yeah, you took him to petticourt.
Yeah, I was in petticourt. And so we went to these testing facilities, and we did like EMP testing, and we put a Kindle. It's amazing. These giant rooms that like, and you just have a device and you can test all the EMPs. It turns out like the razor puts off like 100 times more EMPs than a Kindle. And so I just kept writing these stories because people like were so irate about the fact that they couldn't read their Kindle or play on their phone while they were taking off. And eventually it got overturned. And Bezos, during his earnings call that quarter, was like, on the earnings call, was like, I want to give a shout out to Nick Bilton for like, because it helped his business, of course, you know? And anyway, I ended up meeting with him, and he was like so smart and thoughtful, and just you could tell was on a different level. Like you could just see like, oh, this is someone who never forgets anything. And he was married. He was talking about his kids and how his teenage son still sits on his lap, and then ended up going to a dinner at his house, and he talking about his family, and I met his wife Mackenzie many times, and I was like, oh, he's the guy who has it all. He's like created this unbelievable business. He doesn't, from what I could tell, he's not like, people don't say he's an asshole to work for, right? I'm sure there was some, but most people like really, really loved working for him and stayed at Amazon for years and loved the culture. And then they got divorced, and he ended up in a very, very different relationship. So and now he's like this bodybuilding looking like raver. I think he had it all, but for whatever reason, he had like this midlife crisis that made him throw it all away. I don't know. So that was the one person that had it all.
I want to talk about one more thing.
Do you want me to tell that Walter Isaacson story?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, come back to that.
So Walter told me the story of after the iPad, where he had met Jobs in the Four Seasons, I think it was, which is connected to the Moscone Center, and they had met for breakfast. I don't know if it was before or after the iPad. And Jobs had ordered a fresh squeezed orange juice, and the waitress brings it out, and it's not fresh squeezed. It's got like pulp in it. And he calls her back over, and he says, I asked for a fresh squeezed orange juice. And she brings another one out, again, that's got pulp in it. And he just becomes more and more angry and about this orange juice. And at one point, she's almost in tears, this poor waitress. And at one point, Walter says, like, Steve, what are you doing? Like, it's just an orange juice. Like, she clearly doesn't, they clearly don't have like non-pulp orange juice because it's fresh squeezed, whatever. And he says, if she's chosen to be a waitress for her living, then she should be the best waitress she can be. And it's my job to push her to do that. And it's like, no, you don't know her backstory. You don't know like where her life has gone and why and things like that. And I think that like so for all the brilliance, there was a lack of compassion. And look, I think the reality is like, none of us are perfect. We're all good.
Yeah, well, do you think you have that?
And,
You're one of the best there is. Do you lack that I mean, like, are you accused of being an asshole?
yeah, I fucking love when people call me an asshole. Like, I just like, I just don't give a shit. But like, what I pride myself on is being very, very easy to work with. Like if we're doing a creative, if we're writing a movie together and I'm working with the producers, or if we're doing a documentary, like I am there to make this the best possible. And I will never, ever, ever be an asshole. And you could never find anyone that would say I would, because I understand that what we're doing is really hard and we're all doing our best. And like it's the pursuit of creating great creativity. However, I've picked fights with people as a writer and a journalist and gone after people that makes me into a fucking asshole, quite honestly. You know, like I had a thing when Dave Morin was doing, you know, all of his products and startups, like I went after him and then later I actually apologized to him because I felt like I was too much of an asshole, and we had like a heart-to-heart about it. And I do think like there's a great line that Bill Keller, he was the editor-in-chief of the New York Times for many years, used to say, I don't believe people should be able to write about other people until they have been written about themselves. And I learned that when people started writing stories about me, and it was like, oof, that feels awful. Like that sucks. And it was like a moment where I realized like, oh, like I don't need to be such a dick to people. Like I can write these stories and I can be honest and I can tell the truth, but you need to have some compassion too. And that was something I had to learn in the beginning of my career.
You talk about like your time at the New York Times where you're like, we were in this room and then the room had the portraits of all the important people who used to come to us and try to tell us what they were doing because we were the messengers and we used to kind of shape the narrative out there and they tried to shape us and we shaped the narrative. Yeah. And there was these people who were, you know, you recognize their names from the bylines and you had just like so much respect for them. Do you think that that's still like, does that shit matter at all anymore? Because for me, I'm like, if I'm a founder of a company now, I put $0 into PR. I put zero care in if I can get a press mention. It's like so low on the total pool compared to how it was 15 years ago when I was building a company. That has changed my respect for kind of mainstream. I think Trump really like reality distorted everybody when he started going after fake news. And then you started seeing examples of it. Like, I just feel like the credibility has gone down, but I'm also on the outside. You're almost, you're from that world. Do you feel the same way? Or do you think that's completely misguided?
There's a practical thing of like, you can get an audience on Twitter, on wherever, and you're like, I don't want you, nor do I need you.
There's two answers to that question. And the first answer is that I think 90% of the media is utter garbage. And it is complete and utter ridiculous drizzle that is opinionated and bad for society. And I think 10% is people that are working really, really fucking hard to try to do investigative reporting because they care. And I met those people. I remember those people at the New York Times when I first started. And they were people that were making $120,000 a year and could be making millions, like working for a hedge, billions, I don't know, for like wherever they wanted. And they wanted to pursue the pursuit of honesty and setting the record straight and going after these bad people. Because there are a lot of bad people in the world.
Does that 90% of the crap include your past employers? Does that include
everywhere?
New York Times?
Yes, 1,000%. Because I think, because the system, it all broke. Like it's broken, and I believe it's broken beyond repair for now. My hope is that, and maybe this is me being delusional, but like my hope is that AI can somehow help fix it. But I believe that, or AI in the hands of people can help fix it. But when I first started at the Times, like you weren't allowed an opinion. You weren't allowed. There was no social media. Like there was no Twitter. Like I was at the Times when Twitter came out. Like I remember being in meetings in those rooms and I would ask an editor, right, what do you think? And they would be like, I don't have an opinion on this. I'm a journalist who comes at this impartially and all I want to do is report the facts. And so I think that what happened was you had this, the problem was the internet came along, right? And you had to get to the Times, like I was one of the first ones that came in. I remember being in a meeting once with 40 or 50 people at the time. It was this big meeting, and everyone kind of went around and they introduced themselves and they talked about like where they'd gone to school and how they'd ended up here. I barely graduated high school. Like I literally had a 2.1 GPA. I got kicked out of art school. And like they were all like, I was at Harvard and I worked at the Harvard Crimson and I did this and the other. And I was like, oh, I'm the odd one out here that shouldn't be here, and like was only here because no one wanted to write for the internet. And that everyone became that. And I think that like what ended up happening was you had this generation that came in after I left that was, they were the internet people. They hadn't been mentored. They hadn't learned the ropes, and they didn't, and they felt like they had a right to say, oh, we should not publish Tom Cotton in the opinion section, and we're going to be irate because we did. That is not the way the world works. The world works is by listening to other people's opinions. And I think the reason that so many people in Silicon Valley have veered to the right, which they have, is because the left tells them, oh, you can't think like that, and you can't, and you're stupid if you believe this, and so on and so forth. And I think that so the whole apparatus is completely broken. But at the same time, I am friends with a lot of startup founders who tell me that like, oh, we got a profile in the New York Times and we had the biggest influx of customers we've had ever. Or we got mentioned, a write-up on here or whatever it is, and the same thing happened. And so the eyeballs are still there. People just don't necessarily trust them in the way that they did. And I think that, what's interesting is that you have all these new news outlets that come along, like Semaphore and the Free Press and things like that, and they're trying to get people. They're trying to say we're impartial in the middle and so on and so forth. But inevitably, what ends up happening is as soon as you put that opinion in, the number of listeners or viewers or readers go up, and then the product ends up steering that way. And so, I think that there is a desperate need for something that is. What I think the solution is, honestly, is you don't need a right-wing publication or a left-wing publication. You need a both. You need a place where there are people who have right-wing point of views and centrist point of views and left-wing, and they're all in there together, and they're debating it, and they're respectful of each other, and maybe they disagree, but they are all there. And the problem is the New York Times is all left, and the Wall Street Journal is all right, and so on and so forth. And so you don't necessarily trust any of it.
Yeah, I would love to read the debate. I think that's a lot more interesting format.
Totally.
People who take the other side, two people who each believe or are willing to like argue the best case for each side, so you can read it. And I think that's both entertaining because it's sort of a fight, an intellectual fight, but I think it's also more informative because you get both perspectives, sort of steel-manned.
Yeah.
Is there a story you wish you could write, either if you had like infinite time or, sometimes you get successful and you're like, oh, somebody should do that. It's probably not worth me doing it, but somebody could do that. Is there a great story out there that you think somebody should be doing?
I don't know. My dream is I love thinking about stories from all different perspectives, like how, when is a story a documentary? When is a story a book? When is it a magazine? When is it a tweet? When is it a movie or a 9-part series on Netflix? Or, I write all forms of writing, and I'm fascinated by, there's these different things that are fascinating. Is like, a documentary is the people from the past talking about they're in the present talking about the past, right? A TV series is the story unraveling as you're watching it unravel. A book is you get to crawl inside someone's head for 7 hours and let them understand how visually things smelled and looked and and so I've always I want to write a novel at some point. I think that's like the next thing I want to do. And so because I'm a voracious novel reader, and I just have so much respect for the amount of research that goes into them, and then they become. But then it's like it goes back to the beginning. Like the magic is you don't know that the people that wrote the novel spent hundreds of thousands of hours researching all the history or whatever it is to do that. As far as like a nonfiction, like I just love stories that that old cheesy saying that like, if it was fiction, you wouldn't believe it. It's like I really think that those are the stories that to me are the most fun to read and report and research.
You have all these different seasons of life. You said in evolutions, you said you want to be a war photographer, and then you accidentally became a columnist, and then you became an author. And even though you've disliked some of the guys you cover, it sounds like there is a lot of admiration still for a bunch of others as well. Have you ever thought about like going into the business world since you've been able to see it so closely?
I almost did this year, actually. There was a project that I was going to go do, which was a startup in the storytelling space.
Can you say what it is?
I think that what's happening is there's a change coming in Hollywood as far as how we consume content and short form and the way, there are these structures that happen to stories that become norms. And so, for example, in a film screenplay is 120 pages long because each page is a minute. And that's why when you look at screenplays, they're Courier and the certain font, because each page shot is usually 1 minute long. And so 120 pages is a 2-hour movie. And so there's a whole system set up. There's a book called Save the Cat, which essentially made this world where you on page 1, the first person you meet is your main protagonist. By page 3, you have discovered what the movie is about. By page 5, there's the introduction of the antagonist. By page 30, every single movie, if you go back and watch, on page 30, which is 30 minutes in, it's the changing moment. It's it is the Joseph Campbell, like, this is when the journey begins. And then by page 90, you've entered this third act, and we've come back around, and so on and so forth. And while every movie is different, we understand that that's the same thing. And I think what's happened is that philosophy has been overused. And I think, do you remember the movie Parasite that won the Academy Award? Parasite changed it. And it wasn't by page 60, it turned into a whole different movie. And you were like, whoa, I've never seen that before. And that's why people, I think, really loved it. And I think what we look for in culture is things that are new and different. And every once in a while, a genius comes along who does it. And then everyone else copies that. And then you got to wait for the next genius to come along to do the thing. And I think that that page 1, page 5, page 30, page 90 thing it doesn't work for today's audiences. They don't have the patience to wait till page 30 to find out when the turn is. And so in short form, there's like this new philosophy of like 1 second, 7 seconds, 9 seconds. And I think that but then they don't know how to tell stories. And I think that there's a world where, we were exploring this idea of like thinking about the new approaches of how to tell long form stories and short form bites and things like that. And but at the end of the day, like, the reason I didn't end up doing it is because I just love telling stories, and I don't necessarily want to be like a manager meeting with VCs and boards and getting kicked out by Jack Dorsey.
How many copies of your books have you sold?
Hundreds of thousands of copies, yeah, over time. I haven't checked in a long time, but hundreds of thousands, and they've been printed all over. And
dude,
everything.
Why is American Kingpin not a Netflix 7-part series? I can't
it's been
believe
like
nobody's.
It was one
that into
movie.
an amazing show.
It was okay. That movie was okay. I mean, no, it was bad. It was bad.
It was bad. Yeah,
it was bad.
I'm not going to tell you the story, but the reason it has not is because I got screwed over on film rights deal. So that's the reason why. But it may end up it still may end up there. We'll see.
All right. If I wanted to spend 6 weeks getting as good as I could at storytelling, what would I do? Is there a book, or is there some process? Like, if I was dedicated, how would I become an amazing storyteller? What would you do?
If you're dedicated, you'd need more than 6 weeks. So let's pretend it's...
What can I do in 6 weeks? I got $19. What do you got for me?
If you, I have all these books on storytelling that I read, and they're interesting, and you get a little snippet. I think the most interesting of all the books I read was when I wrote Hatch and Twitter. I really wanted it to feel like a murder mystery because no one knew what really happened. And I read a book on murder mysteries, which was unbelievable. You can read any of them. Just Google how to write murder mysteries. It's a blue book. It's a collaboration where a bunch of murder writers and screenwriters and so on each write a few chapters each. And there's a few things I learned from that, which were which one is when you read a lot of books, people forget to describe smells, and murder mysteries always do. And it's like, and it really brings you in. It's wild to see how it can add like this extra layer, like sounds, smells, the noises, not just the creaking stairs, but the, the mold or whatever it is. It just creates this sense of story in your brain. The other thing is The Save the Cat, which is really interesting. Even if you don't write screenplays, it's a really interesting way of understanding character and so on. And I read a bunch of screenplay books by like some of the old greats, and they talk about characters and things standing in your way and so on. But I will say, for me, the best way to become a great storyteller is to read stories. And I think one of the things that frustrates me about Silicon Valley and the tech bro culture is everyone's trying to optimize their life for the most number of seconds of this and that and the other. And it's like, what they don't realize is that some of the greatest things that they will learn is from things that have nothing to do with what they do. So I'm 48 now. When I was 45, I love listening to piano music. I've never played before. I was like, you know what? I'm gonna just learn the piano. And I got obsessed with it. I learned how to read music for the first time. Oh, look at you! What is that?
I'm on the cover.
That's his like a New Year's resolution.
This is my my
how
year
are you
mission.
doing? How's
well? I'm on the Faber method here, so I'm on book 2A right now. I'm playing.
Nice.
I'm playing.
There's a great app. It's like it's called that I do in my spare time. It's called Notes Teacher, and you just do it for like 5 minutes a day.
It's like sight reading practice.
Yeah, sight reading practice. But I got obsessed. Like I literally would play 2 hours a day, and like now I can play a couple of Chopin songs and things like that. And to me it was just a fun hobby, and it was like really like. But what you learn is that like they are telling a story, and they're telling a story. Hans Zimmer says like, the notes will ask a question, and then the next notes will answer the question. And it's like, and the way Chopin like is just unbelievable if you sit and analyze the music and think about like the highs and the lows and the things that are repeated, and it's amazing. And it started to kind of inform some of the ways I thought about screenplays. And like I read as many novels as I can. I hate nonfiction books. I can't read nonfiction books, which is funny because I write them. They're just boring to me. But I read novels, and I love like just studying as I'm reading, like, oh, that was really unique of the way they did this. And I read a lot of like 1950s sci-fi, and then I read a lot of like 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, incredible, the writers that we all should read. And you just understand that these stories are about people. They're not the stories that we think that it's like the guy who wrote Game of Thrones, George R. R. Martin. I saw him speak once at a conference years and years ago, and he said, you could take my story, you could put it in a spaceship, and it would still work. You could put it in present day, and it would still work because it's about the relationships and the characters. And I think that that's what ends up happening is as you watch something, the best stories are the ones where you imagine yourself as the character, and then you want to know how you would solve the problem. If I'm James Bond, how would I get out of this as the drill is about to, sever my heart or whatever, and then you can't figure it out, and the storyteller does, and you're like delighted by that because it's great storytelling.
I think that's your secret, by the way. You're like, nonfiction is usually pretty boring, but yours aren't. And I think yours aren't because you consume so much content that's, on the mystery side. Yours are page turners. And so, that lateral thinking where you take a skill from one discipline and apply it to another that usually doesn't have it. That's what some of the best business people do as well, is they take,
correct,
the best hedge fund, renaissance is because they took the best AI, machine learning, mathematical prowess and applied it to finance. And like we had Mike Posner on the podcast, and he was talking about how he started as a rapper, but all his hit songs are him singing. And he's not the best singer, but he's like, I am the best writer because he sang one of his lyrics, and he's like, the rhyme scheme I'm using here, the reason people like that hook and it's catchy is because I'm using a rap rhyme scheme, which no singer-songwriters would typically do, but that's why my song sounds different, because I'm using a rapper's lyrics, but I'm singing them in the way that, is rarely done. But it sounds like you've kind of done that same thing.
No, I think it's totally true. And look, I think Jobs Jobs did this thing where he, computers back then were these nerdy like circuit boards. And he was like, oh, I'm going to marry graphic design with technology. And so for me, like I want to marry the style of a novel with a narrative nonfiction story. And there's great writers who've done that in the past that I such admiration for.
Whenever I get done reading your books, like when I get done each time after I've read American Kingpin, I'm like pretty bummed. I'm like, I was so like in love with like reading this, and I was looking forward to finish, or I was looking forward to like I would sneak off to like find the page and see if I can just like read a few chapters. And I felt bummed that like I was like in this relationship with this book and it's over now. And I've like searched so long and hard to find something that could fill that need. And like only one out of like 20 or 30 books like fills that need. I think Mastermind was another great book that was a very similar topic. Yeah. And the author did a great job of a very similar style of storytelling. But in general, it's been really hard for me to find things. I read a lot of novels, but I like sometimes when I read a novel, I'm like, I fall in love with this character. And then I find out that I have to remind myself the character is not real, and I get kind of like bummed about it, And so, who do you view as a peer or someone you look up to, where they do your style of nonfiction storytelling?
Oh, well, just real quick on the novel, like yes, they're not real, but they are based on reality. Like every novelist pulls from the people around them to create the characters that you're reading. So it's like if you go do research into like whatever your favorite book is, your favorite novel, like, and you look at how they did it, if they talk about it, they're like, oh, this, when I was a kid, my grandfather used to tell me the stories about da 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 da, or like there was a neighbor across the street. So I think it is real and it's still people. As far as people I admire and I look up to, I like I said before, I don't really read a lot of narrative nonfiction. A lot of nonfiction. I don't think there's that I have such admiration for people's reporting and even their writing, but it's just I need a story. I can't have so
that's what I'm describing. I want more like story driven nonfiction.
I need a story.
This is the shit, man. I just love learning about this stuff.
Well, you had one last question, Sam, and I interrupted you. Or did you answer it?
It was about Shaan, did you see the documentary on Netflix about what was it called? It was with Ilya. Was it Bitfinex? What was that called?
It was the couple, Bitcoin Bonnie and Clyde. I did a documentary on them for Netflix with Chris Smith, who did Tiger King. That was about this couple that had stolen 5.4. Well, they stole $72 million in crypto, and then were trying to launder it. And they were the only two people on the entire internet who wanted the price of Bitcoin to go down. And they had, every time they were trying to launder it, it would double and double and double and double and double, and to the point that it was at one point at its peak was worth $8.4 billion. And she was this like wacky cringe rapper, and he was like a part-time magician investor. And like, it's one of those stories that if it were fiction, you'd be like, this is stupid. This would never happen.
The guy, Ilya, spoke at the very first HustleCon, which is kind of funny. Oh. And then the woman, Heather.
You're the new Forbes 30 under 30, dude. You spot
listen. The woman, Heather, she was like a copywriter or something, but she wasn't any good. And she like DM'd me asking to talk at one of our things or to like do freelance work or something like that. And then she was kind of a sex freak. I had a bunch of friends that like fooled around with her, and they were like, "This woman's wild, man. You should stay away." like those types of stories. And I was like joking with Nick. I was like, whoever I guess we interact with, just like, maybe 10% of them are going to end up becoming like amazing criminals because for some reason we've been around a bunch of these people like right as or right before they were committing some huge crime. But that was also a good story.
Yeah, that was a great story. That was such a wild story that they went on. They went to Ukraine and like had like fake passports, and I mean it was just it's nuts.
Is making a Netflix documentary, is there good money in that, or you do it just because it's sick and it's like as art and I'm doing this for art? How does that work?
There's not. Look, being a writer, I think it's good money. Like if you can pull it off. There's somebody sent me an article a while ago that you're more likely to become a billionaire than to become a successful writer. And it's like, I think the way in the olden days, at Vanity Fair, for example, or the New Yorker, they had these contracts for these writers. They would get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and they would write 4 stories a year. And then they had the house upstate and the brownstone in Brooklyn. And like, it was a different time. And now, everything's been diluted. Media has been completely diluted, where we have podcasts and blogs and newsletters and mainstream media and all this stuff. And so the advertising dollars and the revenue dollars, it's not like they've gone up. It's just they've been more evenly distributed. And so for me, I just want to tell stories, and I just don't give a shit in what format it is. And so it's really fun to be able to write screenplays, to write books, to write magazine features, to make documentaries, and then it all just kind of adds up from there.
I could talk with you for hours, man. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
We appreciate you. All right, that's it. That's the pod.
That's the pod.